welcome everyone. So I'm not going to give you a full introduction to all the speakers now. I'll introduce each speaker in depth when they are about to speak. But just to say, we're really glad today to welcome 4 speakers who are all, as the title of today's seminar indicates, working in the field, as it were. So we're joined today by Dave Bradley from Child Poverty Action Group, Emily Achesa from Save the Children UK, Yumiko Yokozake from UNICEF and from currently working in UNESCO based in Addis Ababa, and Carol Catley, who's a head teacher here in London. So I will say a little bit more when each speaker begins, but our first speaker is going to be Yumiko. And Yumiko, as I said, is currently based in Addis Ababa, where she works as the director of UNESCO ICBA, which is the International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa. She's got many years' experience in education and NGOs in several African countries, and including working for UNICEF and ICA. And she's going to share, I'm so glad this is working because I was very nervous about that. So do you want to share the video, Yumiko? Is this? Or
yes, yes, I think I will share it from here. If it gets stuck, would you like to take over?
But yeah, it looks fine. It seems to be working. Okay, so thank you. So I'm going to hand over to you, and you have about 20 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion, questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much, Judith. My name is Yumiko. I'm working for UNESCO ICBA, International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, based in Addis Ababa. This organization, this institute works for teacher development in the whole of African continent. So my presentation today is really through the teachers' eyes in Africa on the childhood poverty, especially current situation affected by COVID-19. Very quickly about ICBA. ICBA was established 20 years ago and working on teacher policy and teacher development in Africa with SDG, Education 2030, African Union, and the African Union's Continental Education Strategies for Africa. Improving quality of education through teacher development in Africa is something, oh dear, I'm sorry, I'll go very quickly. So we work on the capacity development, partnership and advocacy, and research and development. And for capacity development, we act on the catalyst, taking on a facilitative role and recognize capacity development as a long-term process. Our motto is African solutions for African challenges. So we do a lot of sharing of examples from countries to other countries which have similar challenges and similar situations. And we look at teachers level, institutional level, and policy level, and we look at the science and STEM and emergency and post-conflict and education for sustainable development, learning assessment, and the language of instruction. Now, since last year, March, we have been supporting teachers in Africa, and the majority of countries closed the schools. So over 1 year. So during the school closure, distance learning took place, but not all the schools and all the children were reached, and the schools reopening was also a major challenge. We have been running weekly webinars targeting on teachers, and then also we have a virtual campus and online courses. From the past experience, we realized that many opportunities are available. Instead of just teaching in classrooms, a lot of resources are available, and some schools and some teachers made a very good use of these resources, but internet connectivity was a major challenge for many countries, especially in rural and peri-urban areas. So it was a very difficult journey. Now, what we came to know is child poverty is evident in many African countries, I mean, many countries in the region, with a diversity both between countries and within these countries. So sometimes the difference between the cities and the rural areas was much bigger than differences between the industrialized countries and developing countries in the region. And the COVID-19 pandemic crystallized existing child poverty issues in Africa. Haves and have-nots became very, very clear, and the gap is widening. Gap has been widening, and we are more aware of the issues. And yet, there are many solutions I will go into later, but they haven't been implemented. So it has been very, very frustrating. The pandemic widened the gap between the industrialized countries and the developing nations, with education sectors resilience and education infrastructures difference, and including the internet connectivity. Now, resources are available, readily available in the web, but just like now that I cannot use that video in this, our connectivity in many countries are limited. And as I speak now in Addis Ababa, the Tigray region in the north does not have an internet at all. So they cannot, and they, even because of the current situation, the gathering of more than 4 people is not allowed. So schools are not opened. So it is not only COVID-19, but the political and the security situations matter very much. And also school closure took some of the basic welfare measures from the children. One of the things is the school meals, but also clean water and the toilet facilities and health education, as well as sanitary pads were distributed to girls in many schools, but it's not done. It wasn't done during the school closure. And also psychosocial support and peer learning were various things that we lost. So what are the fundamental issues? Again, I hesitate to say this because the African continent is diverse and the 54 countries have each a very different situation. So if my simplistic argument offends people, I apologize now. But learning crisis and learning poverty, they exist in many countries. Learning achievement is relatively low. There was, before the election, there was a sensational national crisis in Uganda that after 6 years of formal learning, many children could not even construct a sentence. And similar stories are there in many countries. And strong, and unfortunately, even within the countries, strong correlation to income levels, that the 20 percentile of economic top 20% children from these families do much better than the bottom 20%. And again, if you look at what kind of schools they go, the top 50, top 20, 40% of the income bracket, they go to fee-paying private schools where schools have better facilities, and also schools, there is a better time on task. So the inequity did exist before COVID-19 crisis, but the COVID pandemic widened this gap, because those children who are in government schools, not very well resourced, did not have much learning during the last year. So learning was made more difficult due to the medium, and then learning is in general made more difficult due to the medium of instruction. Many children, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, have to learn in their second or third languages from the grade 1, and that has profound impact on their learning. And the school closure further widened this gap. And the governance and the political and the social stability of a nation is very critical. As I mentioned earlier, currently in the northern Ethiopia, there is a crisis. Of course, crisis in learning, but um, even more severe crisis does exist, and we are wondering how many years it will take to bring the situation back to normal. And during the school closure, domestic violence and gender-based violence increased. And unfortunately, the victims are most of the times young women. And armed conflicts and increased and then the vulnerability of the children. And I think you might have heard of school attacks and the abduction of young female students from Nigeria. This time they were returned within days, but school attacks do take place in many countries, especially in the Sahel region, and this is also something which has been affecting the schools and the children. And resilience and the education system and the children. Now, we realize that the education system are very weak and vulnerable, and then that has to increase its resilience. So disaster risk reduction, capacity to deal with a natural and man-made emergency, and also safe school guidance and measures are needed. And the role of teachers and school leadership are very, very important, but it is not done. One of the examples that during the school closure, many teachers were not paid. So when they're not paid, it's very difficult for them to even get the internet connection to start distance learning, e-learning. And the need for better internet access for teachers and children is one of the lessons learned. We discussed with many countries, telecom companies, if they could provide a free internet access for education purposes, but the offer wasn't forthcoming, unfortunately. On the other hand, many children in the continent are resilient and creative. They have survived the situations. They couldn't go to schools. They have avoided the domestic violence. They survived the situations. And this lead us to think, and it was mentioned during the introduction, the voices of children, especially the voices of young women and girls, must be reflected in school management and education policy. We must build on the existing resilience, and then we must listen to the children and or teachers on that matter, because often teachers can amplify and the children's voices and what children want to say in a more articulate manners. So it is very important for us to have a teacher's voices as children's voices. UNESCO ICBA works mainly with the teachers and teacher educators as well as policymakers. So the voices we hear most are from the teachers. And during the pandemic, we heard almost a scream from the teachers. Teachers' voices were not heard during the pandemic. They stopped the schools immediately and abruptly in many countries. Teachers were not aware that the schools would close the next day. So many teachers took their own money to photocopy some of the vital learning materials and then gave them to the children. I know some teachers who lost all her credit, telephone credit, because she was texting children their homework. So at least if they were told beforehand to prepare, or if they were given some additional resources to be prepared for the e-learning and so on. And the situation would have been much better. And I would like to, during the pandemic, we were all somehow sometimes disappointed by the lack of actions from policymakers and also some of the teachers who completely withdrew from their work. But at the same time, we were impressed and more often by teachers who did the heroic works on bringing learning to schools. And now schools are reopening and they are doing their best. But of course, physical distancing is not really possible in many situations, especially in big cities where the classrooms are already crowded. For example, in Addis Ababa, it is not uncommon for grade 1 class has 80 children. So what they are doing is to have a morning and afternoon shift. It solves some of the problems, but brings another problem that the time on task is extremely limited. However, at this moment, we have been working along with the teachers, and we would like to ask teachers to their best so that they are returning to school for teachers and the schools would somehow become a much happier and hopeful situations. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
We're going to move on now to our second session, admirably keeping almost to our schedule. So I'm very pleased to welcome our second speaker, Emily Achesa. Emily has been working for over 20 years in education and international development, and she's currently the Senior Education Advisor at Save the Children UK, where she works particularly in the area of girls' education. So thank you, Emily. And I think, do you want to share your screen? Is that right? Can you?
I think I'll introduce my colleague first before I share my screen. And before we share our screen, if you can show the film that we shared with you, the 1-minute film.
Right, let me see if I can do that.
So as you're doing that, I can introduce Bati. Bati, are you there?
Yes, hi. Hi, everyone.
Can you introduce yourself, Bati?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Delighted to join you all, and I'll be supporting Emily in this next presentation. My name is Bati Mepani. I'm the global lead of in children's participation within Save the Children. And here we'd like you to now just spend a few moments hearing directly from some of the children that we work with. Thank you.
All right, let's see if this works. I'm a bit nervous about it.
You can enlarge the screen as well. Thank you.
أحب أصير صيدلانية وبنفس الوقت أضلني متابع قضايا المرأة وأكتب عنها أشعار ومقالات. أعمل ترى سرير رجل. اطلع مهندسة كمبيوتر يا عمو مهندسة معمار. بس أكبر بدي أطلع دكتورة أطفال. مستقبلي مسدود خطوة. I'm going to be the boss of the company. I'm going to change the world.
Thank you very much, Judith. So I'll just share our screen here before we start. And do let me know if you can see the screen now.
Yes, we can see the screen, Emily.
Okay. There we go. All right, so to begin with, I'm going to hand over to Bati. I think we need to move back. I'm going to hand over to Bati to take us through the children's voices and the different messages that are coming from the global level. And then I will take over and take you through a project level needs assessment that we've conducted for girls during COVID and the actions that we've taken thereafter, so that you can hear girls' voices from all the different directions. Bati, over to you. And we've changed our title, as you can see there, to reflect the work that we are showing. And the pictures you are seeing are for girls in Mozambique.
Great, thank you, Emily. As you know, one of the key values of Save the Children is really listening to the voices of children, and in particular, the voices of some of the world's most marginalized and most deprived children. And I really would like to build from Yumiko's presentation here. Save the Children last year undertook a comprehensive survey of children and families during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. It was one of the largest surveys to date, where we had just under 14,000 children participating and around 31,500 parents and caregivers participating. It was an online survey with some face-to-face qualitative focus sessions being run. The children who participated, majority of them were part of our programs, our projects. So here you were hearing directly from the voices and the expertise of children who are some of the world's most poorest children or most deprived or marginalized groups of children. This included children who live on the streets, children with disabilities, children who are refugees, children living in conflict, children in rural areas or in urban settings. It really brought together the voices of some of the girls who are marginalized from our societies. And it was a powerful survey which brought to the forefront the impact of COVID-19 upon children's lives. As we move through the slides, you'll see a number of quotes appearing directly from children. Here we have a young girl from Burkina Faso who talks about part of the survey. We asked children, what would your messages be for leaders? And here we need to go to school. We need additional support and catch-up classes to make it. We ask for governments to spend more money to make sure that we can continue learning while at home by providing radios, TVs and internet learning. They must make sure that children in rural areas and from poor families also get to learn. We want to see mobile libraries passing in our communities, delivering books for us to learn. That's a young girl from Zambia. Children, as I mentioned, children around the world really shared some powerful insights. So another young girl from Lebanon shared, take care of us because our situation is only getting worse. Children, it's not a favor. We're not doing a favor for children when we provide, when we ensure they have access to learning, when we ensure they are protected from violence, when we ensure that their rights are being upheld. It's not a favor for children. It's their right. They're entitled to accessing quality education. They're entitled to being protected from abuse and harm. They're entitled from not dropping out of school. They're entitled to receiving basic services. The UNCRC is a human rights framework that places an obligation upon states to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of children. The state is obligated with an overall responsibility to make sure provisions are made for children, including the voices and expertise of children to be part of the solution and not just some problem to be fixed. The SDGs are at risk of being compromised, are at risk of the incredible work that has taken place for over these past 10, 20, 30 years. We're at risk of reversing some of those great efforts that have already been made. And as our colleague earlier, Miko, mentioned, we We are seeing millions of children being denied their rights, millions of children being left behind. We are at risk of not reaching the 2030 promises, the 2030 agenda promises through the SDGs. We promised children that we would end poverty in all its forms everywhere. We're totally off track. We promised children that we would ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. There's been some progress, but it's been so slow. And we promised children that we would achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. This remains unreached. And our SDGs impacted by COVID-19, these inequalities and inequities have been exacerbated. Almost half the world's poor children, without explicit recognition and dedicated efforts to address child poverty, it will be difficult to meet these SDGs or any of the other SDGs. It's really important as we go through these presentations and these presentations that children's rights, our obligation to children, and investing in children is part of a human rights framework. I just want to hand over at this stage to Emily, who will just share a little bit more around what do we actually mean by child poverty? What do we mean by inclusive and equitable education? Plus, Emily will share a very practical example of some of our work in Mozambique. Thank you.
Thank you, Bati, for that global framing. That was excellent. I think in terms of Save the Children, we've published a lot of reports on child poverty. We've published reports on education, and we've gone back to those reports just to bring you a glimpse of what we are talking about in terms of child poverty. We see child poverty as where children have stark deprivations in the realizations of their daily needs. They are exposed to damaging failures and protections, and they have certain uncertain access to food, inadequate shelter, social services, including education, health, and with damaging effects of social inclusion. The whole issue of insecurity, risks of shocks. We've seen children go through, for example, Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. We've seen conflicts in different countries like DRC, Nigeria, where girls were abducted just the other day before the light. And we have seen children being trafficked and going through the different climate change and environmental hazards. The whole child poverty is underpinned by inequalities, from economic inequalities, social inequalities, social justice inequalities, including social inclusion. And these are reinforced by social inclusion and biases in our service delivery and diverse forms of discrimination. So child poverty is multidimensional, as my previous speakers have spoken about, and as is reflected in the SDGs. And this links very well with education, because if we are talking of exclusion and inequalities as reinforcing child poverty, when we zero down to education, we have defined education in Save the Children, looking at both at basic education from ECCD 0 to 6 to 8, all the way to primary education and secondary education. Save the Children defines inclusive education as education that enables all children to learn together with support for their own individual needs, but also looking at equity and not only focusing at equality, because we have to make sure that the fairness aspects is adhered to. This is a picture of girls in Sierra Leone who are studying in one of the projects that we are working with. I'm going to take you through this, the work we've done through this project and the needs assessment we've done last year in July, just as the COVID-19 pandemic hit and schools started closing. In Mozambique, we work in 3 provinces where we are implementing girls' education. This is Tete, Manique, and Gaza. We work in 140 schools, primary schools, 35 secondary schools. And we also support distance learning centers that we have set up in primary schools, about 75 distance learning centers. And we also have what we call community-based education. So we did a thorough needs assessment initially before COVID in 2018, where we found out that poverty, early marriage, underage pregnancies. Mozambique has one of the highest early marriage and underage pregnancies rates in the world. Safety within and around school and community perceptions and attitudes towards education were a huge issue. On the supply side, distances to schools kept girls away from schools and also boys. Limited places in the schools, they had to go on a quota system if they have done well or depending on what districts they come from. And the whole issue of the quality of learning and teacher absenteeism, the language of instruction as we've had before, and lack of textbooks. So we came up with this graphic representation of how we would imagine our intervention would look like. And where you see the three girls walking in, we started in 2013 at primary school level, where we were supporting girls to access education, but also a quality level of education. And 2018, we continued with the same girls that we had worked with earlier to transition to upper primary school. And where you are seeing we've drawn primary schools, we are transitioning the girls to upper primary because we realize they drop out a lot at grade 5. And within upper primary, once they complete grade 7, they drop out a lot without transitioning to secondary because of all the reasons I've highlighted. So we came up with different pathways. We have 3 pathways. There are few girls who move on to regular secondary education, which is on the upper part. There are few girls that move on to distance learning because the distance learning centers were based in the secondary. So we brought the distance learning to the primary school level so that the girls can transition there. And we created another pathway called community education because girls were dropping out a lot at primary level and lower secondary due to pregnancies, work, or different reasons, to give them a 6-month program that would enable them to sit for exams again and either go back to secondary or go back to upper primary. And that was the pathway that we were implementing until COVID hit. When COVID hit last year, schools had just opened in March. So we opened a few weeks and then we closed again. And we had to do a rapid needs assessment to find out what was the effect of the school closures, what were the other alternatives we could use to ensure that we are not just school based, because now children were learning from home, and what learning environments the children had at home. Uh, our rapid assessment looked at mixed methods, reviewing secondary data, collecting data from girls themselves, the caregivers, the teachers, and looking at key informants. And with key informants, mainly talking through the phones because there were movement restrictions. Children were banned from leaving their homes. Adults were not allowed to mix in more than a certain number. And we also did a purposive sampling. So we looked at about 298 children, sample size, including children, caregivers, teachers, and key informants, about 188 female and 110 male in total. For girls, we looked at more girls because this is a girls' education project, about 103 girls versus 27 men, just to compare whether the boys and girls were going through the same. The assessment demographics here is to show you at provincial level, how did we pick the purposive sample? So we picked more girls in all the 3 provinces and a certain percentage of boys, with more girls coming from Gaza, more and boys as well, and very few boys in Tet, which is a more rural remote area. When we looked at the sample, the ages of the sample size, they range from 14 to 20 years. So on average, we saw the average age was about 14 years for the girls and boys. We also looked at the marital status of these children, and mainly the girls. About 5.4% of the girls were married and they had children. 2 of them were mothers and they attended secondary education. Between those 2, one was married, one was not. The other girls who were children attended the distance learning. And also looking at the ages of the girls who were married and had children, they were between 19 and 20. However, they had their kids when they were below 18. So there was no girl attending primary school who was married or had a child. And that's why you can see the highest number bar where they have no children. We also looked at the status of disability, the indicative using the Washington group of questions, and we had 8.5 who had difficulties in seeing, 7% being female, 9.2 had difficulties hearing, 9.2 difficulties walking or climbing stairs, 8.5 trouble remembering or concentrating, and 9.2 indicated difficulty in communicating even while using their local language or usual mother tongue language. Among the caregivers, 19%, 25% being female, also indicated they had a form of disability. So from the data that we collected, the overall analysis or the voices we had from the children and their caregivers and teachers was that all the target respondents highlighted the main impact is the loss of learning time for their children, especially the potential loss of the whole academic year. And mainly children really talked about their anxiety in terms of their future. They were worried about the next steps, especially those who are going to sit for exams, the grade 7, grade 10s, grade 12, and whether they will regress in terms of learning outcomes if they stay out of school for a long time. So the children were really worried and wondering what would happen to them. We also looked on average where the children came from in the schools we were supporting and how many there were in the households. So about an average of 3 students, a ratio of 1 boy to 1 girl per household, used to attend school before COVID, which is quite good. And the most common per household was 2 children attending. But with school closures, they were all staying at home. And as you can see, majority of the children indicated that they are continuing learning from home. Most married girls, unfortunately, said they were not continuing because their responsibilities had increased. Most children learning from home were using exercises and notes that they had been sent by their teachers or by the school, or they were listening to the community radios or the national radio. And the national curriculum had also been stepped down to the community radios for those who had radios. And a significant proportion were not learning from home, which is about 22% of the girls and boys. For those who continued learning by level of education, majority of them, 15.4%, are in primary school with significantly lower proportions, 3.8 in secondary, 3.1 are attending distance learning, though it should be noted that the proportion of representation is not equally distributed across the 3 pathways, that is secondary, regular secondary distance learning, and primary education. For the CBE, learning completely stopped because a proportion of the CBEs were held in the primary schools, and when schools were closed, the CBEs were also closed because they include a life skills component where girls learn different skills like cookery, baking, tailoring, and the different other trades. Provision of learning materials, about, as per the chart below, 65.8 of the children indicated that they had received learning materials from the schools, with a significant proportion indicating that they had not received any materials. When the same question was asked to the caregivers, they also said that about children were receiving materials, but a few of them said that they were not. And we feel that the learning materials specifically, as much as they imply exercise and notebooks at that point in time, there were other materials that parents were also providing other than what was being given by the school, but not all the parents. Then the teacher support across educational levels from the children and parents. 19% of children indicated to have received support from the teachers, and 19.4% of parents also shared the same feedback. And we felt that this is related to clarifications, mainly on what they are learning, and through face-to-face interactions in the few instances that the teachers were able to visit the houses and support the learners. For the teachers, For the parents, some parents said that the teachers were not providing enough support. And we could see some contradictions between what the teachers and the children and the parents were saying. And when they were probed further, this was seen to be the expectation of parents for teachers to be seen on a daily basis. But teachers felt that they were visiting some of the children, but not on a daily basis. As you can see, 14 teachers visited about 14 girls, 58% of the overall reach on average within a week. So 24 learners in the past week. 79% of the teachers indicated to have provided support during COVID. All teachers from TET indicated to have been providing support, while some parents would say maybe not. And this was an average of 2 times a week. And the support is mainly provision of learning exercises and clarifications. Also to say that the government had come up with workbooks that we as a project helped distribute. We also looked at the spaces that children were working in the school. And a lot of children say they didn't have safe spaces either to play or to learn, about 49%. And 40% of these were girls. And we felt that this could be because parents are more protective of our girls, but they also have more household chores than boys to run. We looked at the access to radios, and 40.7% said that they were able to access, they were not able to access any radio across the provinces. The most affected majority, about 75%, do not have access to a radio in Tet, which is a more further rural remote province compared to Gaza, which is close to Maputo. Then we also looked at the use of radio. About 15% indicated using radio all the time, while 47% of all, 37% being girls indicated using radios, but also there were others who had never used radios. And we probed further why they were not using radios, and we realized that even where girls had radios, they had the access, but they had no control. Either the parents would take the radios to the farm were to listen to while they were sewing or working in the farm, or the girls were not allowed to touch the radio. Usefulness of radio content, you can see from the chart there. In the primary education, a lot of children say that it was useful. Quite a small number said it was not useful. In the secondary education, even lower numbers said, or percentages said it was not useful, but majority said it was very useful. And then also in the distance learning centers, because they are used to self-study and all, they said it was very useful. And then the table below provides proportions that affirm to have received the information, literacy and numeracy through radio, child protection issues and psychosocial support, sexual reproductive health, and COVID-19 information. So children, all the past 6.2%, more girls and boys said that they were listening to all these programs on the radio and they had learned a lot. Access to mobile phones, we also looked at that, and you can see that girls do not have that high access compared to boys, although still more girls said that they had no access, but also a high number of boys. Safety at home during COVID, a lot of girls and boys say they felt safe, but when you look at the proportion of girls who say they don't feel safe compared to boys is also slightly higher than the boys. Child well-being at home, we also looked at that. And again, girls, as we said earlier, said that they were facing some child abuse issues, violence, and either verbal or physical or different types of abuse that you can look at in the report. Then those who knew or had knowledge of reporting channels, we can see there were more boys who had more information, but also girls proportionately had some information on that. The whole issue of access to menstrual hygiene. girls had received materials, but not all of them had received the materials.
Sorry,
Yep.
Emily, I'm sorry to interrupt because this
Oh
is
yeah, it's
so...
20 minutes. Okay.
But
So I can stop
no, I don't
there
want to
so that
stop you
if you
in
have any,
I don't want to stop you in mid-flow. If you want to just take another minute to wrap up.
just to conclude, yeah, actually we're almost
Thank you.
done. So I've been through that. Relevance of mess. Oh, am I going backward? Okay, sorry. I think I'm going backward. So as you can see, we looked at all different dimensions of child poverty and the issues affecting them, and we got some recommendations to continue supporting the learners while at home, extending the distance learning support, also advocating for government relaxation for children to do their module tests while they're at home because they have to take them at the centers. We also supported, got recommendations on SRH and MHM, menstrual hygiene management, to make sure that we are not only providing recyclable pads, but also not only disposable, but also recyclable or a combination of the two. And most of the materials we use for pads were also used to provide the local tailors to make masks and different support materials for the girls. We did some adaptations based on those findings, and you can see them there, enhancing the learning skills for girls, providing more remedial classes, supporting teachers' well-being, because we also realized the teachers were facing different trauma and psychosocial issues. We had a back to school campaign, one of a very good back to school after COVID guidance that was adopted by the government. We extended the radio broadcasting and other activities, including bursaries, vulnerability study, community action groups, and coming up with a vulnerability fund, which we hope to implement. And that's the last statement from Bati.
Yeah, we'll just wrap up. We must accelerate progress and investment in education and social protection schemes for children as critical enablers for achieving the other SDGs.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. We're really pleased to be back for the second half of today's programme. So I'm really pleased to welcome our next speaker, Dave Bradley. Dave is currently the England Development Manager of the UK Cost of the School Day, which is a project run at Child Poverty Action Group, where he works, and he's going to tell us a bit about the work of Child Poverty Action Group and this particular project. So thank you, Dave.
Great, thanks, Judith. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that okay? Okay, brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much, Judith, and thank you very much for inviting me along today. It's been really interesting to listen to everyone so far, and I think in a lot of ways, I'm going to build on what's already been said, if with a little bit of a UK slant. So yeah, my name's David Bradley. I work for Child Poverty Action Group, and I guess for those of you who don't know who Child Poverty Action Group are, we're an organisation that works on behalf of children in poverty in the UK. And although we probably are best known for our work on kind of campaigning around child poverty and other aspects, education and its intersection with child poverty has been something that's been on our agenda for a long time. And I'm going to spend a bit of time today talking a little bit about child poverty in the UK, but predominantly about a couple of interventions that we know that work in schools for mitigating the impacts of poverty. And I think on that, it's really important to start by saying that, you know, schools can do an awful lot to mitigate the impact of poverty, and there are some great anti-poverty measures that they can implement. But ultimately, if we're going to eradicate child poverty, it's going to be around changing societal and structural things, not just relying solely on schools, which I hope is something that I can reiterate throughout. So the kind of context in the UK at the minute is that there are 4.2 million children living in poverty, and how that kind of plays out in our schools is that often there can be, depending on the context and the geography, you know, 9 children in poverty in a classroom of 30, which sounds a lot less uncommon than some people might imagine. And I think So this was statistics before, this is pre-pandemic, and for anyone who works in education in the UK, and as has already been highlighted before, this is likely to be higher now and is likely to continue to grow above and beyond 5 million children in 2022. But while children may find themselves in this scenario, and while other groups, certain groups of children may be more likely to find themselves in poverty, there are wider societal issues that are creating the poverty that children and young people are living in. It's only addressing these structural issues that's going to eradicate poverty. And the pandemic has shown us, particularly for families who may be in insecure work or really felt the squeeze of benefits over the last few years, that the pandemic and before has pushed people further into poverty, but also deepened poverty for an awful lot of families as well. So it's this real perfect storm of insecure work, rising costs of living, rising housing costs, particularly in London, and benefit freezes that are trapping families and children in a cycle of poverty. And while this is a kind of a bleak reality, and it's these kind of structural things that are ultimately going to work to eradicate poverty in England, well, sorry, in the UK, it's kind of crucial in the meantime that we're working effectively to mitigate the damaging effects of poverty on children and young people, which is hopefully what I'm going to talk about over the next kind of 20 minutes, particularly looking at our Cost of the School Day project and extended schools provision in schools, both of which are kind of well-evidenced interventions for schools. But before I start on them, I wanted to just pause for a minute on a different definition of poverty that we, along with other charities, use. It was one that was developed by Peter Townsend in 1979. And what this definition really does is outline the importance of understanding poverty as relative. You know, if you are poor, if you're unable to live at the standard that most of the people would expect. And this is really important for us when we're working with schools, and working with local authorities and government too. And I think we would argue that maybe if a child can maybe still have 3 meals a day and has good attendance at school, they're still in a poor household if the parents don't have enough money to ensure that the house is consistently warm, if they don't have access to a computer to do homework, or they can't go on school trips that their classmates do. So I just would challenge people to hold this definition in their minds as we kind of go through today. So first intervention I want to talk about is our Cost of the School Day project, which we deliver in partnership with schools and local authorities as well. And it's a collaborative project between ourselves at Child Poverty Action Group and a charity called Children North East, who pioneered an intervention called Poverty Proofing the School Day. And the quote, which is from the Youth Parliament, kind of encapsulates where we're coming from really nicely, in that education is free, but a lot of things to do with school are not. So why do we think this is so important? Well, we know this because poverty often involves shame and is often hidden, and this is what parents are telling us. We know that from children and their families, they're often struggling with school costs, and there's a lot of shame and stigma around the poverty that they live in because of judgments and assumptions that might be made. You know, we find when we talk to families that they often go to the ends of the earth to hide that they're struggling with money, because there's so much guilt and anxiety involved in not being comfortable with being able to provide for your family. And I say similarly goes for children who maybe don't want to point these things out because they're embarrassed and they don't want to stick out. So what difference do we want to make? And I think just pausing here for a second to say, although we work with schools and we work with local authorities, there is already a phenomenal amount of work going on in schools and within some local authorities that really do advocate inclusive and anti-poverty measures within their schools, which I just think is really important to say. So although we want to, inspire some changes at a school level to, increase poverty awareness and see the school day through the eyes of the poorest pupils, we recognize that schools can only do so much, and therefore that approach has to go at all different levels, through to local authorities and up into places like Ofsted and the Department for Education, because the guidelines and policies that are being shaped need to place much more of an emphasis on income as a driver of outcomes within education than they currently do. So how do we do this? I'll go. So practically for us, So practically, it's all about the school context. And from our perspective, the only way to understand the school context is to talk to the children and young people who attend that school. So the heart of our project is our practitioners working with the whole school community. So that speaking with every child who attends that school, trying to understand their perspective of how they experience the lunch hall, how do they experience traveling to school, how do they experience accessing additional opportunities. Similarly, having these conversations with parents and carers, but also vitally staff, whether that be teaching staff, SLT, or support staff, because it's really important to talk to the dinner ladies who are probably interacting with children on free school meals every single day. How do they see the experience of children? But it's through all these conversations, speaking predominantly with young people, and reviewing things like uniform policies, resource provision, how breakfast clubs are delivered, that we can really build up a picture of the school. We can understand how school costs might affect people within a school. But also, probably more importantly, we start to understand what are the fantastic bits of practice that are already happening, because we want to celebrate these and support schools to promote them. And I think in a school recently is a really good example where they had an unbelievable list of interventions that they were providing for their pupils and were available for families. But after talking with families, we found out that they didn't know about them that readily. So all this really was around the school increasing their communication. It wasn't that parents felt awkward about coming to talk with the school about poverty. It's just that they didn't know these things existed. So by understanding what's working well and the impact of the school costs, we're able to make some changes within the school communities. But crucially, again, it's about this whole school approach. It's about normalizing, talking about poverty, making it easier for students and families to reach out if they do need help. So, some of the outcomes that we've seen in our work all the way up and down the UK and in Scotland, Wales, and in England is this can lead to minimizing costs for families. It could be something as simple as changing the uniform policy so that the PE kit isn't branded. It just takes some financial pressure off families. We work to equalize and make equitable the opportunities that are within the school, whether that's drama, participation in sports clubs, or participation in music. We want to make sure that they're equally accessible regardless of children's income or family income. And also it's really about working with school leaders and school staff so that there's a greater awareness of poverty within the school community, so that every aspect of the school day can be seen through the eyes of the poorest student and every decision is made with that slant. So in saying that we talk to children and young people, what are some of the things we've heard? So I just want to say this is a real tiny snapshot of the kind of things we hear from children and young people and from parents and carers. And I've just focused on home learning and additional opportunities because home learning is quite topical at the minute. Additional opportunities is always quite a big thing. I hope from just reading these 6 and what is, this is just a tiny unrepresentative amount, is that you can really see the difference in responses. The articulation of either finances as a barrier, the kind of shame and stigma that's sometimes attached with that, or often just the sheer weight that can be put on families in terms of the example here of copying out homework is quite stark. But it's little things that can be done to begin to unpick these and make them easier for families. But it's only by having those open conversations that we begin to understand. So instead of just, apart from just hearing from children and young people, a really core part of every single part of the journey that we work hand in hand with schools is understanding what the pupils want. They have such a stake in their own school community and often have incredible ideas of how it could be made easier for themselves and also for their families. And I think this slide illustrates it really nicely, but none of these things are rocket science. I think the kind of things, and the next slide will show them a little bit more, is a lot of these seem quite small. They're small changes that don't cost a lot of money. But actually but these are things that pupils think would make a difference in their school life. So by implementing a few of them, you begin to see that the school becomes more inclusive, and poverty becomes less of a stigmatized thing within it. Some examples of really good practice to touch on, again, a tiny snapshot, many of which we know schools already do incredibly well, but bikes so that everyone can learn how to ride a bike regardless of their income, trips not costing any money. And the one at the bottom, just about being open about the communication around something like free school meals, to make sure, as Lorella said, schools acting as that kind of welfare hub almost, but you want every parent to be accessing everything that they possibly can to help them and their child. So the process, takes on a whole host of different things, and there's tons of great practice. And a big part of what we do is be able to learn about this great practice and communicate it across the local authority areas that we work in, but also share it with our colleagues in Wales and in Scotland as well, to really share what's working well for children and young people and families. I guess to hammer home my point even more around, it can't just be schools, I wanted to just use a case study of our work with Dundee City Council. And these are the things that the council committed to after taking on board everything that was heard from parents and carers, children and young people within their council as part of Cost of the School Day. And these are the commitments that they made in order to make a more equitable education system within their area. And I think this really gets to the heart of what we're talking about when we're thinking about the link between child poverty and education. Making sure no student starts school hungry, making sure every year P7 student has the same experience, and making sure every pupil has the same and correct uniform levels. Well, I'm not going to say levels the playing field. It makes education more equitable in these ways, which we think is really important and something to celebrate. So that's our very whistle-stop tour through Cost of the School Day, which we still actively working on in schools in London and Coventry, in South Wales and Scotland as well. And I have to say, I've tried not to mention the pandemic too much, but we have been working with schools throughout that time. And as you can probably imagine, the level of need has been quite stark. The second kind of anti-poverty measure for schools that I wanted to talk about today is something that we've worked really closely with schools and also with the partner organisations on, and that's a policy approach called extended schools. So what are extended schools? Super simply, they are kind of interventions that go beyond the core functions of a school day. The Extended School Programme was a pillar of the Every Child Matters policy agenda, launched in 2003. And since then, even though national policy has changed, there's not ring-fence funding anymore for extended school provision, a lot of schools still continually provide an element of this extended provision. And that manifests itself in a number of ways, which everyone, lots of people would know that kind of there's a large provision of breakfast clubs among schools, with almost 75% of them providing a club. But childcare provision in services is much less common. Only around half of schools in our own research provided after school childcare clubs, and only 29% provided holiday childcare. And I think this is really important for us when we kind of are recognizing that tackling poverty in schools and what that impact has on the day-to-day classroom often happens outside the classroom in terms of those positive interventions. And I think we're really, I'd be amiss to say that we know that schools at the moment are struggling with a whole host of different challenges, whether that be funding or ever-growing levels of poverty in their schools. And this definitely isn't us saying that schools should just be doing this off their own back. It's something that needs to be properly resourced and properly funded, so that schools can really make that impact for their children and young people. I just want to run briefly through why we think this is so important. I'm going to do this try and do it through the eyes of parents and carers and practitioners. So we know that extended schools supports family finances, and this could be done in kind of exactly as already been described today, as the school being a welfare hub, whether that's having welfare advice from the local council or local CAB, citizens advice, sorry, embedded in school, where practitioners can build relationships with families. You know, that kind of one-to-one support is really, really is really valued. And on our own pilot with the Greater London Authority, you know, we had parents accessing thousands of pounds of additional support. But another way that we can support family finances is that breakfast clubs, after school clubs and holiday clubs really do provide convenient and often low cost childcare for parents. Childcare being one of the biggest outgoings of parents alongside rent. And this can support parents into work, which provides a route out of poverty or prevents families falling deeper into poverty. Benefits. Another benefit is that it helps to increase attainment. You know, extended schools helps pupils to engage more positively with school and actually helps to narrow the attainment gap. And it does this because attending after school clubs benefits the attainment of disadvantaged children more than non-disadvantaged children, really helping to shift that gap. Also, the research is really strong in that these programs can also positively engage parents with their child's education and the schools more widely, because there's opportunities for conversations just outside of your regular day-to-day schooling. Really importantly, it also helps the health and well-being of children and young people. You know, whether that's play, physical activities, breakfast clubs, these are all really important parts of health, well-being and development. And by improving children's access to sports and cultural facilities, these can be really enhanced. The research has found that children participating in these activities often get on better with their peers as well. And last but not least, but there's also great benefits for the wider community. Schools are so often the hubs and the centres of their community. I find particularly primary schools, where parents have their friendship groups, where they're going every day. But actually delivering these extended provisions often requires schools to build partnerships and relationships with community organisations in their local area, which has really, really big impacts for better links with the local community. I really love this quote from Manchester Communications Academy, just about the sheer number of people that go through their school every single week from outside of their pupils. To finish off, I'm aware of time. I just wanted to finish with some lessons learned from schools and practitioners about anti-poverty interventions within schools. Schools are often at different parts of their journey, often doing tons of things already. But for those getting started, we really learned from schools and practitioners that these are the key things when it comes to starting your journey. It's what practitioners are telling us. And it's very much about the things I've talked about. It's about understanding the context and understanding the community. It's about building relationships, both with external providers, with parents and carers, and beyond and other family members. And it's identifying the things you want to change, because every school is unique and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And finally, for schools who are already a long way down their journey, we really learned from schools that actually to going beyond the 3 tips we got from practitioners about deepening that impact was actually around things like consistent communication and actually finding out through evaluation what works for your context. And I think the quote is the best one to land on, which I think hammers home the point of both cost of the school day and extended schools, is that the best way to do this is to actually just talk to families and talk to pupils and understand what they need. And that's everything from me.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was really great. And I'm glad that you emphasized at several points the sort of background structural issues, that the point that, we know that the underlying causes of poverty are much deeper and will not be addressed unless these background structural issues are addressed. And at the same time, there's an awareness that there's a lot schools can do to mitigate the effects of poverty immediately, on their own children and staff. And this is something that very much came up in our round table a few weeks ago, and that I think is an ongoing theme in this series. How do we navigate that tension between not wanting to lose sight of the bigger picture, but also wanting to support schools in doing what they can to mitigate some of the worst effects. So thank you very much, Dave, and we'll move on to our our next and final speaker for the day, Carol Catley. Carol is head teacher at Deansbrook Infant School, which is a community school in North London. She's been head teacher there for 9 years, but before that she had many years, I think 23 years, you said, Carol, experience as a teacher, mostly in early years. And I should say that I'm a governor at Deansbrook Infant School, which is how I know Carol, and so I've seen the amazing work that they've been doing, especially over the past year. So I'm very glad that Carol's agreed to come and share some of her insights with us. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, and hi everybody. Lovely to be here today. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen before we start. Okay, can everyone see that all right? Sorry, I can't get on to slideshow. We'll carry on like that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the impact of the pandemic really on our more vulnerable children and our families. So although we do a lot more than I'm going to talk about today, this is really just about the impact of what's happened in the last 18 months or so, just under 18 months since we first went into lockdown last March. I'll start by telling you a little bit about our school. Here we are. So we're a very diverse school in Mill Hill in North London. We're on the Mill Hill Edgware border. We are 256 children at the moment. We're an infant school, so the children are aged 3 to 7. 190 of our children have English as an additional language out of 250. And across the school, there are 46 different languages spoken and approximately 27 different ethnicities. So as you can see, we are very diverse. Across the school, the children who are eligible for pupil premium is about 20% across the school. However, as we've talked about before, that doesn't necessarily mean they're the only children in poverty in our school. We know there are many others that don't quite hit the threshold for various reasons, but still are living in difficult situations and do not have enough money or other resources as other children in our school. We also have a very wide social demographic range across the school. We have a lot of children who come from professional families living in private houses, but also a huge amount living in deprived areas, families in temporary accommodation, families who are being moved around a lot and are living in very small accommodation for big families. So we have a huge range across our school. So lockdown last March, all a bit of a shock for everybody. I know when the lady was talking about African schools and how little notice we had, there wasn't that much difference in England, to be honest. We had very little notice the first time that we were going to go into lockdown. And so it was quite a challenge to get our school ready very quickly. So one of the main challenges we had to start with was making our school social distance. We had to have a one-way system. We also had to think about the age of our children. Our children are 3 to 7. So we had to think of ways that we could things we could put in place that were easy for them to understand and that they could adapt to fairly quickly. There were lots of, I won't go into all the details, even things like going to the toilet. We had to restrict how many children could go into our toilet area at one time, and they had to have little spots that they stood on outside the toilets and take a band. It was all very complicated, but our children did us proud and picked it all up very quickly. Also, when they did come into school, because school was still open, obviously, for our key worker children and our vulnerable children, they then had to get used to working with different staff, working with different children in a different classroom. And these were very young children. Some of them had only started school the September before, so had literally been in school 4 months, had just got used to everything, and then suddenly it was all turned upside down. So these are the sort of things that, you know, we knew were going to happen, but they weren't really mentioned, particularly in the media. It was kind of like, you just need to make your schools COVID secure. And actually the impact on very young children was not mentioned a huge amount. So we did our best to make it as a smooth transition as possible for these children. So the key workers, so that was a challenge in itself. The list was endless, and also the second lockdown, it was even longer. So we were having to be really careful about which families we could take. We had a limit to how big our bubbles could be and how many children we could take in one go. And also the boundaries changed. So to start with, this time round in lockdown, the government said originally that only one parent had to be a key worker, and then that suddenly changed and both parents had to be a key worker. So that was quite difficult because we had many families desperate really for their children to be in school. So one of the things I wanted to talk about there, you know, we had lots and lots of parents phoning us up asking us to take their children. And it was very difficult because obviously as a school and as an educationalist, you want children to be in school. That's what we're all about. And suddenly we were having to say to parents, we're really sorry, but your child can't come into school because our bubble's full. It was heartbreaking. I remember one particular parent phoned and said she was a beautician working from home and wanted to keep having clients at home, which obviously was against every rule in the book. And could we take her children? So we had to explain no, that we couldn't for various reasons, and that actually she shouldn't still be doing that work from home. So 2 weeks later, she phoned and said that her job had changed and she was now a delivery driver for a supermarket. And could we now take her children, which obviously we could. So it was those sort of issues that we were having to deal with on a daily basis. And then our vulnerable children, across our school, we have 10 children that have educational health and care plans. So those are for children with complex needs that usually need one-to-one support at least part of the day, if not the whole day. And those children were entitled to a place in school. Now, not only were they entitled to a place, but most of those children also need a member of staff. So that again brought up other challenges because we were limited to how many staff were in school. Some were shielding and some were having to be at home preparing the home learning for the blended learning. As a side, we also were dealing with staff who were anxious, staff who had their own families, staff who were living with elderly parents or elderly relatives, and they had concerns about catching COVID themselves and then taking it home to these elderly relatives. So as a head teacher, you were dealing with a huge amount of different things and trying to reassure everybody as you went along. So the impact on our very vulnerable families is this young man with his laptop proudly walking along that he'd just been given to take home. So first of all, the financial implication. A lot of our families weren't necessarily pupil premium families, but had come from abroad within the last year or so into the UK, had taken jobs where they hadn't necessarily got any form of contract, or it was possibly cash in hand. Therefore, they weren't entitled to furlough. So suddenly found themselves with no source of income whatsoever. So that was something we hadn't predicted. We hadn't really thought about happening before. And we had a lot of families coming, making contact with the school, asking for help. And at this point, we realised that one of the things they really needed help with was food. This was the first lockdown I'm talking about now. So before things like the government vouchers came in, because that took a little while before that all happened. So we spoke to our staff, who were amazing as they always are. We even had staff that went out and did a weekly shop and brought it into school for us to give to our families. And we set up a food bank in our playground. The first week we thought, is anyone going to come? We might get 2 or 3 families. I think it was 28 families that first week came into school to pick up their bags of food to take home. unbelievable response, and we carried on doing that throughout the first lockdown until the vouchers finally came into being. Second lockdown was not so bad. We had a couple of weeks of food hampers, and then the vouchers were much quicker in the second lockdown, and we were able to support our families in that way. Again, though, the food parcels obviously were available to any parent that came into school, whereas the vouchers were only available to children who were pupil premium. So there was still a need for those that didn't quite make the threshold. Then we had home learning and blended learning. So this was really about the second lockdown. So this was a massive challenge for staff as well as parents. We were suddenly having to get our heads around programs like Google Classroom, Tapestry for our younger children, which is an online two-way communication for parents and teachers. But then parents were having to have devices that children could log into to access these the learning, and also support their children. So this gave us lots of challenges for our poor parents, who some of them didn't have devices. So particularly our vulnerable families didn't have enough devices at home, because many of our families had 2 or 3 children, some at secondary school, some at junior school, some with us in the infant school, and they were trying to prioritise the one device that they had at home, or sometimes no devices. And another issue was data. So we had families who were trying to use their data to download the work for their children, and by the time it got to the infant child, their data had run out. So that was another issue that we were having to deal with. We managed to get 2 laptops from the government in the end, because the government laptops were mainly for children of year 3 and above. And of course, our children are year 2 and below. So we weren't the only 2 children that got a laptop were children who had a social worker at that time, although more about that later. So we had to, basically, we got our own laptops at school that we usually use in class, and we labelled those all up, put them in cases, and gave those out to parents who needed them. The data was a bit more difficult. So again, data was only offered by the government to year 3 and above. So we did all sorts of things to try and help parents with data. We set up a workshop on a Wednesday morning so that any parents could come into school and use their laptops or devices in school. We had staff there to help them, and also they could use the school internet to do some work with their children. So and then going back to what I said at the beginning of my presentation, remember that a lot of our parents didn't have English as a first language. A huge number of our parents don't speak English as their first language. So not only were they having to deal with not having any money, not having enough food, not having devices or the IT skills to support their child, they were also trying to teach their child in a language that wasn't their first language. So a huge number of challenges for our parents. There were 1 or 2 families that also were struggling with parenting. So we've ran parenting classes at our school for many years, and obviously those had stopped. And if you're a parent who is struggling, then trying to persuade your child to sit down at a device and take part and engage in school learning can also be a real challenge if you're struggling with parenting skills. So that was another thing on top of everything else. So the blended learning, we've talked a little bit about that already. So we had Google Classroom for years 1 and year 2, and Tapestry for nursery and reception. So this was, from the children's point of view, this was very difficult. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how hard this was for these very young children. They were suddenly watching their teacher on a video. I heard one story of a little boy in reception who kept talking back to the video of his teacher and couldn't understand why his teacher wasn't responding to anything he said or answering his questions. But he was 4 years old. He didn't really understand what was going on. So we recorded lessons rather than live teaching, although that was a debate in itself at the beginning of the second lockdown. And we had a lot of pressure from actually the government and Ofsted to have live teaching, although it wasn't ever compulsory. But in the end, we stuck to recorded lessons because we listened to our parents, and we also listened to our junior school who had gone down the live teaching approach. And they were saying that us having recorded lessons made it easier for our parents to support children in both schools, because obviously recorded lessons can be watched at any time. They don't have to log in at a certain time. The other advantage was, because of a lot of parents not speaking English as their first language, recorded lessons were more useful because you could rewind and watch bits over and over again if you weren't sure about it the first time. And also the children could consolidate their learning if they needed to as well. So one of the things that was hard for our children was this lack of verbal response. That was probably the most difficult thing for them. So response was always written either on Tapestry or Google Classroom, and that was very difficult. So we did start then a huge amount. Our teachers worked so hard phoning many of their children on a daily basis to talk to them, to tell them they were doing an amazing job, to answer any questions that they had, particularly about their learning, and to also reassure parents. In addition to that, we had a list of the more vulnerable families, which was about 70 families, even though only 40 of our families are pupil premium. And we RAG rated those, and we contacted them very regularly to make sure that they were understanding what was expected of them, because actually the difference between the first and second lockdown, the first lockdown, online learning was a kind of almost like an option. Yeah, it'd be nice if you would have a go, if you could. But the second time round, it was like, you have a responsibility as a parent. You should be teaching your child from home, which obviously as a school we agreed with, because the children were missing more education, but it was very difficult for a lot of our parents. So the verbal response was something that children really struggled with. It was, and as teachers and as, in the school, the hardest thing we were finding was monitoring which children were engaging and why they weren't engaging, and also tracking progress, because it's very hard to tell how much a parent has done of a piece of work, and how much support they have given a child. So although we would get some beautiful pieces of work, there was sometimes a bit of a dilemma about whether the child had actually done it themselves. So those were issues, and they will continue, because now the children are coming back to school. We will see, whether the progress has continued as we've hoped while they've been at home, engaging in the online learning, or whether actually we have got a lot of gaps to fill, and a lot of catch up to do. And then the emotional and social impact, which again, I don't think we've seen the actual impact of this yet. I think it's going to go on for some time. To me, this is more of a worry than the educational, the academic impact. I feel with the academic gaps, we can work hard as a school, we can put interventions in place, we can make sure that those gaps are filled as quickly as possible. But the emotional and social impact is more difficult to judge, and also more difficult to deal with. We know that the children, social skills will have been affected by this. We know that these very young children really need those interactions with other children, and the adults at school to develop those skills, and they will have missed out on that. We have a scheme at school, the Colour Monsters, which you may have heard of, which is based on this book. So it's about a monster that changes colour depending on how he's feeling. We've done a lot of work in school. So in September to Christmas, when we were back in school, seems a long time ago now, we did a lot of work on this in school, and we helped the children to self-regulate when they came into school each day and think about how they were feeling. And we also got them to think about how they felt about the lockdown and being at home, and then coming back to school and all the changes that had happened along the way. And we will do that again on Monday when the children come back to school. One of the things that happened was we knew that one of our little boys in our school, who was only 5, that his father had died from COVID during the first lockdown. So when he came back to school, we were monitoring him very closely. He didn't say anything, he didn't talk about it, even though there were lots of opportunities to talk about lockdown and their experiences. And in the end, his class teacher said to him, I understand that something very sad happened to you during lockdown. And he said, no, nothing sad happened at all. And then he said, oh yes, I know what you mean, my fish died. And the teacher said, oh, and he talked about that, but didn't mention his dad at all. And so we talked about it as a senior leadership team, and one of our Senko spoke to him again on his own and had a very direct conversation with him and said, I know that your daddy died. And suddenly it all came out, and he thought he wasn't allowed to talk about it at school. And that was a real eye-opener for us, because we suddenly realised that maybe the children, it wasn't that they didn't want to talk about it, but they thought for some reason that they couldn't, and they weren't to talk about what had happened at home and about lockdown once they were back at school. So we then did a lot of work using the colour monsters and reassuring the children that it was okay to talk about to talk about lockdown and what had happened at home in school. And that really helped to open up those doors and those conversations. Okay, I just wanted to put this in because I think I got frustrated last year how every media report said the children had missed 6 months of school. But actually, during the first week lockdown, they missed 22 weeks, approximately, according to the school holidays. During the 2 lockdowns, they'd missed 22 weeks of school overall, 110 days. So in the first lockdown, they missed about 70 days of school, about 38% of their year. And in the second lockdown, they missed 40 days, which was only about 22% of their year. So I just thought, keeping it all in context, because I think some of the, hopefully our children were too young to take it on, but I think the parents were, it was quite negative about they've missed 6 months of school, they're going to be so far behind, they're not going to get their GCSEs when they're 16, they're not going to go to university. And I just felt, and it's happening again this time, actually, and it's really unhelpful. Our children are only 4, 5 and 6 and 7 and have a long way in their educational journey to go still. And I think some of the media coverage particularly is giving a very negative impact and making those children feel like they've failed already. Before they've even come back, and that there's nothing they can do about it, and that the lockdown is going to make them failures in life. And I don't think it will. I think if it's dealt with properly, I think if the right interventions are put in place to support those children, both academically and emotionally, then they will be fine and they will get there, as long as we're aware of that and help them along the way. And then moving forward, so what will change? So I have talked about this quite a bit already, but as I've said already, the mental health is particularly a worry, but the physical well-being as well. So after our first lockdown, we noticed that quite a lot of our children were quite overweight when they came back to school, and they hadn't been before the lockdown. And this is clearly to do with diet, why they'd been off school, but also lack of outside space. A lot of our children live in small flats and don't have a garden. Obviously parks were shut and closed and they weren't able to go to those. And we think there was quite a lot of sitting, watching television, eating the wrong sorts of food. So that was something we suddenly became aware of and are now monitoring, and we will be again this time round. Also, there were certain tests that the children have missed. So children in infant schools have height and weight tests, which have been missed because of lockdown, and also hearing and sight tests, which had also been missed. That one particularly worried us because in the past, we've had children who are not making the progress that we've expected, and then the hearing and sight test has happened, and they've picked up on things early that we've then been able to deal with very quickly. So we're concerned about that on long term, and there are gaps there that will need to be filled very quickly. Mental health, as I said, we've talked about a lot already, but we do need to make sure the children have the tools to deal with those emotions and to move forward from lockdown with their physical health and their mental health and their well-being. And then the children's academic progress, again, I've already said, although I think there will be gaps in their learning, I do think that schools will be quick to act on this and quick to monitor, to ascertain where those gaps are and put things in place to help the children catch up as quickly as possible. We did this in the autumn term already. We assessed the children very quickly when they came back to school, found out where those gaps were and put in interventions to help them. And in some cases, we had to move the learning back slightly in the national curriculum. So the year 2 children, for instance, revisited some of the year 1 curriculum before they moved on when they came back in September. Mainly in things like phonics, because we know with phonics and particularly maths concepts, that if those are not taught properly and there are gaps, then that will have an impact further on when the children progress with those subjects. So we've made sure that that's happened, and that will happen again. And then just to finish, really, I wanted to talk about the shift, the role of the school, and this has been touched this afternoon already. But I also feel that as a school, we've been asked to do more and more than just educate the children. We're no longer simply the educators. We are being responsible for the children's physical health. We're being responsible for their mental health, as well as their academic progress. Just recently, we were contacted by social services because another impact of the pandemic is that we found that normally in our school, we have 2 to 3 children that are on a child protection plan at one time. At the moment, we have 8 children on a child protection plan, and most of those came to light during the autumn term when they came back from the pandemic. And we will obviously be very vigilant when the children come back again, and we do fear that that might happen again. And many of those are domestic violence, and we know that nationally there's been a huge increase in the number of domestic violence. So just recently, a social worker, has asked the school to go and visit a family at home, which has never been our role before. That's always been something that the social worker has done. Also, we've been asked to talk to, use the school nurse a lot more with the physical well-being and support the children's mental health. So even CAMS, which is Children's Mental Health Services, is so overwhelmed at the moment with the number of children it's having to work with, that they are asking schools to take on more and more of that side of the children's well-being. And that would all be great if we had the resources in school to deal with it. So unfortunately, over the last few years, as I'm sure you all know, the school budgets have been cut and cut. Personally, as a school, we've had to make redundant our welfare officer and also our learning mentor, who took on 2 of those key roles within the school. And what we found is that other members of staff are having to spread themselves much more thinly, because obviously we still need those roles, and it just means that other people are having to do it along with what they are already doing as part of their jobs already. And that's worrying to me as a head teacher for the mental health of my staff, but also that it's impossible to do those jobs in the same way and to the same depth as it was when we had somebody who was just concentrating on that area. So I think going forward, that is a real problem for education and for schools. Personally, I think hubs are a good idea. I think it would be more sensible to have education and social services and health all working much more closely together, and that schools had a health person and a mental health person and a social worker that's linked to their school and to their children and families. Because it is the schools that have those relationships with parents and get to know those families really, really well. Often we have 2, 3, 4 children from the same family that come through our school over a number of years. And so we get to know those families extremely well. So it would be a two-way platform that we could help those other professionals in the same way they could help us. And that's where I would like to see schools going in the future. And I think I've nearly run out of time, so I'm going to have to stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Carol. And I think it was great to have these 2 presentations actually from Dave and Carol, because they really worked well together. So much of what you were describing, I think, was similar to the sort of issues that Dave was picking up. Okay, so it just remains for us then to thank all of you again so much for coming and sharing your ideas, sharing your work with us, allowing us to really benefit from all these different perspectives internationally and nationally, and it's been really valuable. So thank you, everybody, and thank you to the audience, those of you who've stuck around for your contribution. And we hope to see some of you at future seminars.